and there were stars in the sky. It was in the midst of this promise that we left Abram, still childless, but trusting in God's promises. This week, our story again takes place in the land of Canaan, but a lot has happened since the night God directed Abram's attention to the stars. For one thing, God renamed Abram to Abraham, and Sarai was named to Sarah, and to this elderly couple, indeed, a child was born named Isaac. Isaac fathered two sons, Jacob and Esau, who were twins. Esau was born first, and therefore was the son entitled to the birthright bestowed on firstborn males. But Jacob and his mother conspired to trick Isaac into blessing Jacob with the birthright, which caused all sorts of trouble with Esau, forcing Jacob to leave home for more than 20 years. Jacob did eventually reconcile with Esau, which brought him back to Canaan along with his 12 sons and his new name, Israel. One of those sons was named Joseph, and it is he who is the main character in our story today. Ultimately, this is a story that explains how the Hebrews came to be in Egypt in the first place. Now, if you grew up going to Sunday school, you probably learned all about Joseph's coat of many colors from the classic Bible stories. If not, maybe you learned it from Dolly Parton's song. Either way, most of us are probably acquainted with the idea of Joseph running around in a rainbow of patchwork and his brothers being filled with envy as they slouched around in their plain brown tunics. So perhaps it came as a surprise to you that today's reading called Joseph's coat a long robe with sleeves. That, unfortunately, is the price of some of our newer translations. They offer greater clarity, but the downside is that sometimes they pull the plug on treasured memories. Joseph's robe has gone from being the amazing Technicolor dream coat to being nothing more than a size bigger than his brothers. I don't know if that bothers you, but it did bother me. So I did some research on it. And without totally geeking out on you, what I learned is that the idea of a coat of many colors came from a mistranslation of the Septuagint, which is the primary Greek translation of the Old Testament. The Hebrew words behind the expression coat of many colors is ketonet hasim, for which there is no known meaning. So translations vary. The NRSV, which is the translation we typically read, calls it a long robe with many sleeves. The King James Version, which most of us grew up with, calls it a coat of many colors. The NIV calls it a richly ornamented robe. Now what's interesting is that there is only one other time that this contested phrase is mentioned in Scripture, and that's in 2 Samuel, where we're told that King David's daughter Tamar was wearing a long robe with sleeves, for this is how the virgin daughters of the king were clothed in earlier times. That's the same phrase used for the robe Jacob made for his favorite son. So it stands to reason that since ketonet pasam was the kind of garment that daughters of kings wore, Joseph's garment probably was intended to represent some level of royalty. So, if you're one of Joseph's brothers, then the message seems pretty clear that at the very least, Jacob wanted Joseph to rule over the family after Jacob died. When we enter into the story, Joseph is only 17 years old. Tradition dictates that it is the oldest son who inherits this responsibility. Sibling rivalry being what it is, it's no small surprise that the other brothers resented Joseph. But it gets worse, because if you pamper a child long enough and then put a royal robe on him, sooner or later he's going to actually believe that he's a king. Well, this is exactly what happened. Young Joseph began dreaming about his authority, and he had absolutely no problem telling his brothers all about it. In today's reading, Joseph is sharing one of his dreams. He says to them, "Listen to this dream that I dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. Suddenly my sheaf rose up, and then your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." Do any of you have younger brothers? I have 3 of them. And believe me, I know how it feels when your blood starts boiling because this little know-it-all twerp is informing you of just how superior he is to you. Joseph knows his brothers hate him. He's not just some wide-eyed little boy innocently relating a strange dream. No, sir. This is strategically calculated to raise as much ire as possible. I know this kid inside out. I lived with 3 just like him for 18 years. And believe me when I tell you that what he's really doing here is rubbing it in that Daddy loves him best. So, it should come as no surprise that they hated him even more for sharing his grandiose dreams. And there's one more straw that wasn't in our readings today, but you should know about it because it was very close to being the final straw. The paragraph right before our reading tells us that Joseph worked with his brothers tending their father's flocks. And then he told their father unflattering things about them. The wording that's used here is basically the ancient Hebrew equivalent to Joseph was a snitch. So the stage is set. Daddy Jacob has set Joseph up by coddling him to the point where he has an overinflated sense of his own importance, and Joseph has turned everyone against him through his bragging and his tatting. So when Jacob sends Joseph out to check up on the boys, this indeed is the last straw. They conspire to kill him, and they might very well have carried it out, except Reuben, the oldest, didn't want to go quite that far. So they ended up keeping Joseph in a pit until some Ishmaelites come along, and they sell him to them for 20 pieces of silver. While Joseph is on his way to Egypt, his brothers hatch another scheme to explain his disappearance to their father Jacob. They took Joseph's extra large coat and dipped it in blood, and then presented it to their father, who recognized it at once. As Jacob descends into a pit of despair over the loss of his favorite son, Joseph arrives in Egypt, where he is sold into the household of a very important Egyptian official. Within no time at all, he rises into a position of prominence, but after refusing to give in to her seductions, his master's wife falsely accuses him of attempting to rape her, and Joseph is thrown into prison. While in prison, he did some side work interpreting dreams for a couple of other prisoners that was so accurate that when Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, needed someone to interpret his dreams, Joseph was recommended for the job. And it was through this dream job that Joseph was released from the royal dungeon and elevated to the highest position in Egypt after Pharaoh, of course. The kid leads a very charmed life. He's thrown into a pit and pulled out. He's sold into slavery but quickly becomes head slave. He's thrown into prison and pulled out, and then again he smoothly floats to the top. There's actually a very big gap in our reading today because we read first from chapter 37 and then we jumped to chapter 50. But ultimately, his brothers end up in Egypt standing before him, not knowing who he is and looking to buy some food since there's a big famine going on in the land. Eventually, after messing with their heads for a bit, Joseph reveals who he really is and then insists that the whole family move to Egypt, including Jacob. They do, and Jacob is overjoyed to have his son back. Everyone seems to be very, very happy for several years, but then Jacob dies, and the brothers begin to panic. They worry that with Jacob out of the picture, Now Joseph will want a little payback for what they did to him all those years ago. So they come up with a story that Jacob's last words were a plea that Joseph forgive his brothers and not do them any harm. When Joseph hears this story, he cries, the brothers cry, and they fall down before him and offer themselves as slaves, which of course brings to mind the dream about the sheaves. But instead of seeking revenge, Joseph says to them, do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people as he is doing today. So have no fear. I myself will provide for you and your little ones. And he does exactly that until the day he dies, which ends the book of Genesis, placing the Israelites exactly where God had promised Abraham that they would end up, in Egypt. This is one heck of a long story with enough material in it for several seasons of Netflix, but I want to zero in on this last little scene because I think that that is what is speaking to us today. Joseph tells his brothers that even though their intent was evil, God ultimately had the last say in the matter, which led to good. And that's good. That's comforting. But it also leads to a lot of uncomfortable questions, such as, if God can turn evil into good, then why allow evil and suffering in the first place? And if God ultimately has the final say on the matter, then do we really have free will? And how can we even call something good or evil if God uses what is meant to be evil for good? And finally, isn't pointing to God's ability to redeem evil a way of not honoring the real suffering that evil causes? As we learn from our series on the book of Job, there are no easy answers to these questions. But while the book of Job tends to muddy the waters even further, what is very clear in this story is that Joseph gains strength from his disappointments and his trials. He is transformed from a spoiled, narcissistic kid into a model of compassion, forgiveness, and leadership. He is able to use the painful experiences of his past as a vehicle to wisdom and maturity. In his capacity to suffer, Joseph discovers his ability to change. His difficulties help him mature. And we learn from the story of his life that obstacles, pain, and suffering are opportunities for us too to grow as individuals. Perhaps you have experienced something similar. I know that years ago, I myself suffered great harm from someone that I thought I could trust, but who turned out to actually be incredibly evil. The harm done to me was not unintentional or a mistake. It was calculated and it was deliberate. It wounded me very deeply, but even though I couldn't see it at the time, it led to a huge spurt of transformative growth in me that made me a much stronger person while also softening me considerably. Now, I don't believe for a minute that God orchestrated or even allowed that evil to be done to me just so that I could grow. For one thing, it was counterintuitive to God's dream of a peaceful world. And for another thing, the harm that was done to me spilled over onto other family members. But I can see where considerable growth took place that might not have happened otherwise. Does God allow evil? Do we really have free will? Is there even such thing as good and evil? I don't know. But I do know that while being wounded and losing our innocence brings us face to face with evil, it also provides us the opportunity to use those very same wounds as a source of ever-increasing compassion and power, and to see that what actually appears as evil might actually be an aspect of the provoking force that unfolds the soul to its true extent. I think that's what happened as Joseph stood before his brothers all those years later and forgave them. And I think that's what happened on the cross, as Jesus asked that God forgive his executioners of their sins. Jesus was looking the ultimate evil right straight in the eye, but he used the pain, humiliation, and betrayal to tap into the very best of himself and find that place of compassion and strength to forgive, overcome, and ultimately resurrect. It's a contradiction and it's a paradox, but it is right in the middle of a paradox that healing is found, and we discover what it means to be truly free. Each of us, like Joseph, is given an amazing story set in a world of suffering and redemption, tragedy and miracle. And each of us, like Joseph, have the same opportunities to grow in our compassion and wisdom. Joseph's brothers opted out. Sure, they grew and matured as human beings, but even at the very end, they were still manufacturing stories out of fear that Joseph would retaliate for something that they had done years ago. Joseph, on the other hand, had long since moved past being that irritating little tattletale. Joseph had grown and matured, which enabled him to forgive and embrace. By the end, he realized that it was not about coats or power or dreams of glory, but about God's dream of a future where we forgive and let go, not just for our sake, but for the sake of that future. Today, may we remember Joseph, not just for his coat, but for his ability to dream God's dream. Amen.